Good afternoon. This is Dr. Bryson, and this is a video for the criminal profiling class for the summer of 2023. In this video, we're going to talk about a logical fallacy that shows up in more places than most people realize. And that's called confirmation bias. Now, confirmation bias is a very important concept to know about and to attempt to avoid when you are a criminal investigator. And we're going to see why here. But let's kind of look at what confirmation bias really is. It shows up, this term, in a lot of research, because confirmation bias in research is when the researcher themselves will design their study, and then they'll collect and analyze their data in such a way that their hypothesis is confirmed. In other words, their research is always going to confirm what they want it to say. Now, this doesn't mean that they're doing this consciously. Most researchers, when they're doing this, they're doing it subconsciously. That's why it's important for researchers to be very objective, but also to be very self-aware and to be more intentional about steering away from confirmation bias. But in logic, just in general logic, this is where the person is making an argument and they are only looking for things that will support the argument they want to win. In their mind, everything they say will result in the truth of their conclusion. For example, wanting to give the death penalty or life without the possibility of parole to juvenile offenders, a person might say, adult time for adult crime. Okay, well, that is a wonderful phrase, but it doesn't prove logically anything. It does not prove a thing. It sounds really smart, but it's not. It is not. Because what it's saying is that I'm going to ignore all the research about how juveniles' brains are different. I'm going to ignore everything I know about human development and how children are very impulsive and don't make very good decisions. I'm going to ignore all of that and make this phrase. Okay, so that's in logic. But now let's talk about criminal investigations. Okay, confirmation bias is where we become so focused in our investigation that we are only focused on evidence that supports the conclusion we have already formed in our heads, and then we exclude all other evidence. And we justify that because we truly believe what we're doing is objective, but we justify it many times based on experience. Well, in my experience, it's this, so we've got to go in that direction. Well, your experience in a previous case or all previous cases may not be right for this particular case. So it's important to understand how confirmation bias works. Now, confirmation bias and anchoring, and we will talk about anchoring next unit, the confirmation bias and anchoring go hand in hand, because in investigations, what happens is that an investigator gets anchored to their hypothesis, and then they go about the confirmation bias procedure. In criminal profiling, confirmation bias is an important concept to understand, because what happens is that we get so focused on confirming our profile, or we get so focused on wanting criminal profiling to be this wonderful thing that we only look at the evidence that makes it look like profiling is good. For instance, if you look at the Green River Killer profile, which you're going to be doing later on in the semester, you'll notice that some of the things the profile got right. Okay, but how did those items really help narrow the suspect pool? They didn't. But see, with confirmation bias, we'll look at those things and we'll say, gee, look how brilliant this person was. Instead of saying, oh, they said it's a white male. Well, that's the majority of the US population. So how does that help? So it's important that we understand that. Now, confirmation bias works because in the textbook for your chapter reading for this unit, you'll notice that the very first section with a heading is called the inference of traits. Okay, the inference of traits, because that's what criminal profiling is about. In literally for 5 decades at least, we have been involved in a confirmation bias related to criminal profiling, and that is that we want to believe that the crime can give us a strong inference of the traits of the perpetrator. In fact, let me read the very first line under this section. In the most basic terms, criminal profiling is the inference of distinctive offender traits from physical and/or behavioral evidence. Distinctive offender traits. Okay, so distinctive offender traits. That means that we can infer things distinct about this offender that would not be true about other offenders. So saying they're a white male is not a distinct offender trait. That's the majority of the US population. Okay, well, let's say they're a black male. The suspect pool, if that is true, which usually it's not, but if that is true, is still so large that that is not a distinctive offender trait. It just isn't. But what they're getting at are psychological traits. Because you see, in psychology, we have this idea that we have personality traits. So criminal profiling says we can figure out those personality traits, and through those personality traits, we can figure out other things based on what we see at the crime scene. So we can gather this behavioral evidence by the crime scene. We can see what their behavior was like in the commission of the crime, behavioral evidence, and then we can create a profile, a psychological profile that tells us their psychological traits from this evidence. But here's the problem. For those of us who are therapists, we know about traits versus states. In other words, anger can be a psychological trait, or it can simply be a state that a person is experiencing in this moment. You see what's going on with criminal profiling, and Turvey points out that what I'm calling states, he would call secondary traits. Okay, they're not secondary traits, they're states. They're a state of being in the moment that's transitory. We all have those states sometimes. We all get angry sometimes. We all get anxious sometimes. And so secondary traits are how they are labeled in the book. But here's the thing. Secondary traits then doesn't tell us anything, because guess what? We all feel angry sometimes. Okay, the perpetrator felt angry here. Gee, isn't that wonderful? Is this a trait, a psychological trait? And if it is, how does knowing that narrow the suspect pool? It doesn't. First, we don't know that it's a state or a trait. There's no way we can figure that out from the crime scene. We can figure out if they were angry, likely. If whoever committed the crime was angry, maybe, but maybe not. There are some exceptions when it comes to reasonable doubt. There's always reasonable doubt there. But so maybe it's a state, maybe it's a trait. Maybe they weren't feeling anger at all. Maybe we're misreading. Maybe what looks like anger is something else. So that's very important to understand when we talk about confirmation bias in criminal profiling. I'm going to stop the screen share now. So I know that I'm bursting a lot of people's bubbles, okay, because we have fallen in love as a people in the US. We've fallen in love with true crime shows, especially shows like Criminal Minds. We've fallen in love with all these movies like Silence of the Lamb, and pay TV or subscription site movies like Mindhunter. We've fallen in love with all of this stuff. And why have we fallen in love with it? Because it's exciting and it's entertaining. Well, I love excitement and entertainment as well. But here's the thing. If that's what I'm looking for in my job, in my job, I am finding perpetrators and getting them convicted and sending them away for long, perhaps life sentences. I need to give up the idea that I need to find a way of making my job exciting and entertaining, and start living the idea that I need to show some respect for the rights of all individuals. So we have to understand that the work that a profiler, that any criminal investigator does, is very high stakes. You get it wrong, you leave a perpetrator on the streets and send an innocent person behind bars. So you got to be very, very careful, because you have to exercise wisdom, logic, and intelligence in such a high stakes area. We've got to give up this idea that Criminal Minds tries to give us about the criminal profilers, that these are brilliant, intuitive people and they just know these things. Okay, that is a bunch of bunk. We cannot let that be how we determine guilt or innocence in a criminal trial. Hard evidence is how we do it. Not being biased by our intuition or our experience, but looking at every case objectively and trying to let the evidence speak to us rather than trying to make the evidence conform to our preconceived notion. We'll see you next video.